And I believe that we are now live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of the FCCI Cacao Academy. It is a pleasure to be here. My name is Lauren Heineck, and I have been invited to be moderator of this series. This is a digital collaborative cacao farmer peer learning platform that is being developed by Dr. Carla Martin, Harvard lecturer and executive director of the FCCI, and Alyssa J. McDonald-Bertel of Cacao Academy. We are joined today with two esteemed guests, Dr. Amanda Berlan and Dr. Michael Odijie. And today we'll be speaking about the topics of sustainability, political science, anthropology, on the cocoa production and supply chain. And if you are joining us live on Facebook, thank you for again being a part of this community. You can find the past episodes of this on the FCCI YouTube channel with Spanish subtitles. And to kick us off for today, I will pass it over to Carla and Liz to share any updates over the last week.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you, Amanda and Michael, for being here. We're really thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with you and to learn from your work. Some updates from us are that we have completed a very in-depth rapid evidence assessment on one of the countries in which we're working, Nicaragua, and have learned some really important lessons about how to appropriately design the farmer trainings in that area. We are now beginning a process of key informant interviews, of finishing the write-up of that rapid evidence assessment, so there will be a situation analysis that we can share with others, and we are now stepping also into curriculum and instructional technology design for that particular area, and we're very excited about that. And Liz, I'll turn it over to you if there's anything else you'd like to add.
Absolutely. As Carla mentioned, key informant interviews really pay into the work that we'll be talking today with Michael and Amanda about. In terms of what is important for us at the FCCI Cacao Academy is to make sure that the curriculum and the technology choices that we are looking to identify really map to what farmers are interested in and actually need. In a lot of developmental agriculture, there's a lot of fluff and a lot of programs that are thought up by a lot of people, but often too little times actually meet the needs and interests and capacities of farmers. So as Carla mentioned, in-depth interviews with farmers and stakeholders, but then also all the farmers. We also very, very happy to have yesterday finished a survey that we were doing with the farmers specifically to understand what sort of technology do you have access to? How do you like to learn? Do you like to learn through a friendly conversational style, or do you like to learn through an expert? Where's WhatsApp or Facebook, or how's radio advertising? What are all the different methods of communication that exist in a day? So then we know how to bundle up and bring across the farmer training that they are interested in according to the challenges and opportunities that they have in the way that they love most. And I think that is absolutely the best way to kick off with Michael and Amanda today, because you two have spent quite some time going deep into farmer needs. So we're delighted to host you today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you both. With that, Amanda and Michael, would you spend a couple of minutes speaking about your background and your current work? Amanda, would you start?
Cool. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this session. So I'm Amanda Berlan. I'm based at Montfort University in Leicester, which is currently in lockdown, unfortunately. And I've been working on cocoa for 20 years now. It's 20 years this month that I've first went to Ghana. I've worked in Ghana, I've worked in South India, I've worked in the Dominican Republic. And I think over the years accumulated many, many thousands of interviews with farmers.
My
name is Michael Odijie. I postdoctoral researcher at University of Cambridge. I've been working with farmers for five to 6 years now. I've lived in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and my research in relation to this conversation has to do with the politics of sustainability in cocoa cultivation in both Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire.
Excellent. So we'll dive into the conversation today with a series of questions. And Amanda, we'll start here with you. You just mentioned in your introduction both COVID-19 and the fact that you've been in cocoa for 20 years. So seeing where we are with the virus at this point and as it moves through the world, how do you see that this might impact the knowledge transmission, agriculture extension, and also the collaboration in the cocoa supply chain? And I'll also just add a little excerpt there for people that might be listening, because this was a new term for me that I learned, and that's agricultural extension. And that is the application of scientific research and new knowledge to agricultural practices through farmer education. If you do have anything to add to that definition, please do so as well.
Okay. I mean, I think the first thing I should say is that I haven't been in a cocoa producing country since the start of COVID. So in terms of the impact that it's going to have on transmission, I think what I must say here is that my impressions, my views are just purely reactions and impressions rather than based on any pure research at this point. I mean, of course, we know that generally COVID is going to be bad news for everyone in the supply chain, not just the farmers, but of course that the poorest will be hit the worst, as usual. Coming back to agricultural transmission more generally, I think COVID is further complicating an already messy, problematic area. We already knew before the pandemic that there were problems with agricultural extension services, with sustainable livelihood interventions not working effectively. There was a study that came out a few months ago that indicated that some farmers are targeted many times over and receive the assistance 4 or 5 times, whereas others are completely neglected. So in some ways, given how ineffective the situation was already, of course it's not going to improve things. I think what this does do, though, is it really does give us an opportunity and new impetus to start again. And I think this is where initiatives such as this one are very, very valuable. You know, we need to do things differently, not just because of COVID, because as I say, we knew already that there were problems with the effectiveness of training programs and those kind of things. But this has perhaps given us the kick we needed to go in the right direction. So let's try and be positive, I think.
And you tend to look at a holistic approach to the livelihood of farmers and how they're affected by their surroundings and practices. And what are you anticipating, or what might you think are some of the interventions that could come into play that will be collaborative in sorting out where we are in this point in time?
Well, I think clearly we're going to have to rely on digital means much more. I mean, I think again this is where this intervention is exactly, I think, what's needed right now, because the old models that we had, as I said, were not being very effective in a number of ways. You know, this idea of sitting farmers in a room and, you know, almost treating them like children with somebody at the front in front of a blackboard kind of going, this is what you need to do. That kind of training isn't particularly exciting. There's vastly more exciting teaching methods out there. There's ways of engaging farmers that are vastly more interesting, especially with supported with the right things. It can really lead to behavior change. So things like, you know, digital platforms are ideal, because we need to experiment with new models and be creative. So yeah.
And Michael, what about you? Your work has focused a lot on the cocoa sustainability programs. Do you see any interventions that might be most effective in this time?
Well, effective in what sense? Because there are different interests involved in cocoa sustainability. Sustainability of what? There's the environmental issues. Cocoa is one of the main drivers of deforestation in West Africa. There's the commercial interest related to securing supply of multinationals like Nestle and Mars. They want to sustain supply of cocoa. There are other issues like child labor, slave labor, farmers' livelihood, or better income for farmers. So modern sustainability purports to take all these different issues into account. This is not possible because there's a potential contradiction between some of the issues. So if you take for example, there's an inverse relationship between slash and burn. the process of deforestation, and labor costs. So if we focus on just saving the forest, almost by definition, you are increasing the labor needed by cocoa farmers. So if you focus on the labor angle, then you're leading to much more deforestation. How do you solve this tension? There's also a potential tension between livelihood and securing supply of cocoa beans. That's in light of boom and bust and given the opportunity costs. I'm speaking in relation to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Given the opportunity cost of cultivating cocoa, there's also a tension with that. So how do we deal with this? Sustainability assumes, most of the sustainability program now, if you read the literature, takes all of this into account and just purport to be doing that, to be solving all these problems. It is simply impossible. But just to answer your question head on, what type of intervention and collaboration do I see to be more effective? From the farmer's perspective, I think any intervention that takes into account this different systematic nature of cocoa production, I think that would be extremely effective. Recently, last year, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the government of Ghana and the government of Cote d'Ivoire came up with something called COPEC. It's an agreement between both countries to charge, I think, $400 more. So the assumption is that they've calculated the cost of producing cocoa sustainably, and then added that to the price of cocoa. And this is supposed to start in the October of this year, but because of COVID, I'm not sure if that's even possible now, because the price of cocoa since January and now has reduced by 20%. From now, there's a problem with price now. So the idea of increasing the price in October is completely impossible. But just to answer your question, I think any intervention that takes into account the cost of producing cocoa sustainably, that would be the right intervention for farmers.
Thank you. Any comments before we move on to the digital space?
Yes, picking up on Michael's commentary here, the work that Carla and the FCCI team did earlier this year with a flash poll identifying and asking producer groups what experiences they were noticing quickly from COVID. One was reduction in sales, but at the same time, the work that Carla, please chime in when you have a moment, what you found was that also cost of inputs going up. So the actual profitability of doing this.
Liz, I can see that your connection is frozen, and it may be that we're taking too much bandwidth here and across our different continents where we're speaking. So I'll summarize briefly. Essentially, what we found is that the cost of doing business for cocoa farmers increased, but that the sales of cocoa farmers decreased. And people were actually reporting when we did this survey in April that sales had decreased by a number of percentage points. It could be 10, 20, even 50%, while their input costs had gone up considerably, and they had additional costs that were specific to COVID, things like needing to invest in personal protective equipment, needing to invest in additional tools that would support with social distancing, needs to change their labor practices so that people would be working spaced out, and so on. Unless I can see that you are now back and moving on the screen, so please feel free to jump in if you'd like to add anything else.
No, like you and I are always yin yang. You can complete my sentences perfectly.
We'll work through the technology issues here, and we'll step into the technology space around farmer training. So in terms of that, both of you, I would love to hear what are your thoughts on digital literacy and how that might affect where Carla and Liz are approaching this platform as they move forward.
I think if I may jump in here, I think the problem with digital literacy is that, well, I think first of all, one has to be a little bit careful where we're talking about. So let's not assume that cocoa farmers are a homogeneous category of individuals, because they're not. So digital literacy is going to encounter different challenges in, say, the Ivory Coast to what it would encounter in the Dominican Republic. Issues with farmers not being able to read and write, issues with farmers not being very comfortable with mobile phones, problems with network coverage, affordability of being able to buy credit, having sometimes the power to to charge mobile phones and things like that. So there are different challenges in different places, and that's what one needs to be aware of. There are some tendencies that are kind of across the board. Generally, women are less comfortable with digital technology than men, so digital platforms tend to work a little bit less well with women, but that's not necessarily insurmountable. Again, it depends really how accessible the material is.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the average age of cocoa farmer in West Africa is 50, 51 currently. And there's a huge digital divide between urban, non-urban, even with gender, as well as age brackets. Older people tend to be less willing to take up new technology. Younger people are. And as it happens, the average age of cocoa farmers in West Africa, it's, I think, 50, 51. In Ghana, it's even, I think, 54 the last time. So the digital training of farm, I'm not sure how this would work in West Africa, specifically in Cote d'Ivoire. I mean, there are some cocoa villages for which some of them don't even have normal electricity. They don't even have the basic infrastructure. So talking of digital literacy, that's 2-3 steps further.
I think there are some interesting learnings that can be taken from mobile money, because there was this initiative a few years ago to pay cocoa farmers digitally, and that has had some very notable successes, but also some big challenges. So I think it's worth delving into some of the case studies on that to inform your own work. There's some good stuff in there. I mean, it shows it's got potential at the very least.
It does. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I mean, I was also thinking of the cost of adopting some of the training, because I was reading the other day the raw material from Cocoa Action. The training, because the guys doing Cocoa Action, they also train farmers in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Some of the farmers just can't take up the training because there's a cost attached to it. Whether it's pruning or having to weed their cocoa farm, their farms better, there's a cost attached to it. Obviously, there's a benefit, but I mean, so how do you deal with that cost part of it? I don't know.
Well, I think there's also an issue around trust, because as Michael's just identified, actually farmers have been trained in lots of ways, and actually some of them, partly because they're an older generation, are a bit fed up of training, and actually they don't necessarily trust that the training they're going to receive is going to be any more effective or is worth the money that you'd be spending on it. And so it's about, I think one needs to be aware of that and sensitive towards that, but actually it may take up a bit of time to actually build a relationship and actually show them that actually this is different. This isn't going to involve sitting in a classroom for 3 hours in a baking heat, being shown a picture of a tree and being told how to prune it, which is something that some of them have been doing 50 years. I think what you're offering here is a very, very different product, but it may take a little bit of time to gain traction just because of their previous experiences.
Absolutely. In work research I'm currently doing at the moment is specifically regarding the effectiveness of cacao farmer training and various multifactorial impacts that influence that. For example, availability of financing, materials, and inputs. So Michael, as you say, the availability of the materials to translate the knowledge into a new practice. Or Amanda, as you were mentioning before, the relative nature of the training and the fit to the farmers. These are massive barriers out of, I would say, ignorance that we have been living with in agri-development for the last decades in this assumptive approach. So this is certainly one thing, making sure that the training is fit for purpose for the farmers' needs and what they have available to them. So for example, in a very concrete case, what Carla and I are working on at the moment with the Nicaragua project is identifying exactly what even tools and materials, what are the vision, the vision and health challenges that farmers have to even do the sort of skill that they would like to learn. So we even adjust the pedagogic journey along what they have available, what their capacities are. So you're learning the skill to fit the outcome you want, as opposed to trying to go the other way around. These are very basic things, yet I think are often under considered.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've always been amazed how much of a top-down approach has been used in agricultural training. I remember years ago looking at some of the training material, and they had the names, and this was training material that was intended for Ghanaian farmers, and they had the names of shade trees in Latin. So they had the correct botanical names in Latin, which is fine if you have a degree in classics or a PhD in botany, but for your average cocoa farmer, this was of no use whatsoever. And you can kind of imagine somebody producing this material thinking, I've done a good job, that, you know, for accuracy you can't beat this. Sure, but for relevance it was hopeless.
Absolutely. We've also looked at the literature on inequality and technology, which is really an emerging field that has come out of looking at, for example, the sharing economy and tools like Uber, or, you know, the ways in which Twitter behaves in social spaces. And some of the interesting findings that are there propose that when people do, especially younger people, are able to access technologies, some of the things that we have learned about technology adoption start to look different. So for example, young women become some of the earliest and most successful adopters of technology when they're able to solve a problem in their lives using that technology. One of the areas where this has been most effective is the beauty industry globally, which of course is, you know, one of the most understudied industries because it's seen as, you know, a thing of women and not serious and you know, superficial. But what we learn are really interesting lessons about technology adoption there and the creativity that women, especially women of color around the world, might employ when trying to solve a very real problem in their lives. And so we're excited about the possibilities that might come from choosing technologically appropriate and culturally appropriate tools to use, and how they might be creatively adapted by these different groups. And using Liz's research on effectiveness of cocoa farmer training, the survey and the interviews that we're conducting in Nicaragua, we hope will guide us toward implementing the appropriate technologies that can then be adapted in those ways.
Certainly. I would love to segue from this place of trust and sharing and technology and spend a moment, both you and Amanda, Michael and Amanda have spent time studying the objectification and the commodification of farmers and the use of advertising, or just in general with larger corporations. And as Liz and Carla are developing this platform, how might they go about being sensitive to the advertising or the promotion of such a platform when incorporating the photos or the words of the farmer partners without objectifying them, the farmers themselves?
Michael, do you want to go first?
No, you can go first.
Okay. I think, first of all, I think that the fact you're even asking the question, I think is wonderful. I wish more people and organizations would ask themselves questions about how they represent farmers and cocoa farmers specifically, because I think an awful lot of mistakes have been made in this area in the past. I think, as ever with anything around photography or representation, you've got to be concerned about transparency, privacy, consent. I mean, just securing a level of consent, obvious as it sounds, isn't necessarily a given. I think one always has to ask oneself, how staged is this? How truthful is it? Am I representing something the farmers, something the way the farmers see it, or am I just representing the truth as I want them to see it? I think an important question that people need to ask themselves is, am I fueling racial stereotypes? Because I think there's an issue around that as well. But I think the really exciting thing about this initiative is that you're working with farmers. So why not just give them the cameras and say, hey, take some photographs, show us what you think is important. I have a PhD student who works on soil and water management on cocoa farmers in Ghana and Ecuador, and she's used photography in her PhD, and she gave the farmers cameras and said, hey, go off, take some pictures, show me what's important in your life. And the stuff they came back with was absolutely brilliant, really good, really interesting. So I think there's real scope here to be creative. And, you know, often the farmers will want to make sure they get a copy of a photograph. Great, make sure they get copies, or maybe show them, if they're not sure what to do, show them different types of photographs. But I just think, you know, there's massive scope here to be creative and do this really, really well. Yeah.
I mean, I could not have agreed more with Amanda. Yeah, I think the way I view most cocoa sustainability programs, especially from multinationals, they are all staged. Most of what you read about sustainability are just false. I mean, the good thing about this training program is it's peer farmer to farmer. So I think that is very interesting. And I agree with Amanda that if it's possible to give farmers not just the voice, but to put them in the driver's seats, to get them to do the things themselves, I think that would go a long way. I'm much more interested in the material as opposed to the representational part of it, though. But yeah, but I think in terms of representation, yes, that would go a long way. I agree with Amanda.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And you've highlighted something that for us is important, is that ultimately we would like to be obsolete and unnecessary. And, you know, so essentially what we're doing is we're taking expertise that we've had the privilege or the luxury to develop with the idea that we can support people who are better positioned to do these trainings in the language, in the country where they live, that are culturally, you know, sensitive and aware of what's going on in that country, and create a system of peer training that makes outside intervention less necessary, beyond sharing the kinds of global lessons that are available to people like us, but less so to people living on cocoa farms themselves.
Thank you. And Amanda, you have spent some time, a bulk of your research, studying the causes around child labor. And spoiler alert, there are many, not a single cause. But within that, how could you use the voices of children to perhaps ameliorate the problems around child labor?
Yeah, I think the problem is that people still don't feel that it's possible to engage with children and actually learn anything from them. And often when I talk about my research on child labour, people say, why do you talk to children? What are you going to gain from them? The problem's poverty. There's nothing more to say. Poverty causes child labour, and that's all you need to know. And I don't agree that that's where the story ends. We have plenty of poverty in the UK. We don't have a child labour problem. So clearly it's necessary and important to go beneath that. And in my own research, I've actually learned a tremendous amount from talking to children about the reasons why they're working. And I think it's important to engage in order to be able to make successful policies. I remember many, many years ago, there was a program in South America to try and get street children off the streets. And their training material, the material to reach out to these children, basically emphasized it again and again that, you know, it was what children were doing was very risky, and, you know, they could get killed and those kind of things. And they found that their program had absolutely no success whatsoever. In terms of behavior change, it achieved nothing. And they did some anthropological work to try and really talk to the children and kind of understand, okay, why are you here? Like, what must it take to get you off these streets? And they found that one of the things that the children feared the most was illness and disability. And that was the most crippling thing. And actually, rather than having this bleak message of telling them, you know, actually you might get killed, which the children were not scared of at all. They were fully aware that everything they did could result in death. But actually kind of discussing with them, okay, but if you do this and you get disabled, what happens then? Or if you get sick doing this? And then suddenly behavior started to change. It's about engaging with people on their terms. Similarly, in cocoa producing communities, my belief remains that there's a problem with child hunger and child malnutrition. And until we solve that, the children are not going to be in school and they're not going to be learning effectively. And this is a message that, again, I've shared again and again and again over the years. And a very common response is that, well, you know, from the industries, well, we're not the government, we don't deal with child feeding, you know, that's not our thing. But actually, if you're serious about stopping the child labour problem, you really need to look at child hunger. And I think the child hunger problem is very much going to be exacerbated by the coronavirus, because it is threatening food security, it is threatening already precarious food distribution systems and all those kind of things. This is a worrying situation. It really needs to be addressed now. So I think I've given you a very broad answer to your question. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah.
And Michael, within your work, you have critiqued how a lot of companies focus on the productivity being an integral piece of farmers' welfare. Would you speak to a little bit of what you see would actually be in their best interest?
Okay, yeah. I'm speaking precisely in relation to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. The best interest would be to diversify, to stop producing cocoa. The reason for this is because, especially in Cote d'Ivoire, there are two production factors that led to increase in cocoa production historically. The one is almost free labor. There's I think from 1960 to 1998, there was a free migration from neighboring countries to Cote d'Ivoire. The other is the land, forest land. Both factors, and they are no longer available now. So there is currently a transition from using forest and free labor to cultivate cocoa to sort of post-forest cultivation. So most of the problems we are experiencing now in Cote d'Ivoire have to do with this transition. My argument is that there's no need for this transition. It's better for cocoa farmers to just diversify and start producing something else. There's a problem with this argument from the sort of government perspective, because cocoa is one of the main sources of foreign exchange in Cote d'Ivoire, as well as Ghana. But from farmers' perspective, there's enough evidence to show that farmers that diversified, especially in Cote d'Ivoire, they are currently doing better than former cocoa farmers that diversified away from cocoa to maybe cassava or anything, even if it's food crop as opposed to cash crop. There's enough evidence to show that they are doing better now. So the solution from farmers' perspective would be for them to diversify. There are so many problems with this solution, but these problems is actually not my concern. One of the problems, there will be a reduction in, maybe an increase in the price of chocolate, a reduction in, but this shouldn't be the business of cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire, because they don't even consume chocolate. So if you're looking at the problem from just their angle, the solution would be for them to diversify into other crops. Okay?
And I think that is key to the issues I raised before about food security. You know, this makes so much sense from so many different perspectives.
Yes.
So I couldn't agree more with what Michael is saying.
Oh yes, actually there was a research, the paper I was reading yesterday, in Ghana, during the period of reduction in cocoa production from late 1960s to I think 1982, there was an increase in food production, because most of the cocoa farmers, they stopped producing cocoa. They started producing rice, cassava, domestic crops. So when the government came up with this program to get them to go back to producing cocoa, most of this new diversification, most of the farmers stopped diversifying and they went back to cocoa. So there's an inverse relationship between increase in cocoa production and reduction in and you can say food security, but I would say a reduction in domestic food crops like cassava, corn, maize. They can just diversify away from cocoa and start producing this. From the micro level, it is better for them to do this. And also on the child labor issue, I think one problem with the way you sort of talked about child labor, it's almost sort of ahistorical, because if you study cocoa from a purely historical perspective, you can see, especially in Côte d'Ivoire, the link between deforestation and increase in child labor. Now, not so much child labor, I mean, increase in other type of labor, for which child labor is one of them, slave labor is one of them, the increase in family labor. François Rolf, the French scholar, in his 1991 article, he showed the link between deforestation and increase in family labor, and also increase in cocoa farmers. They stopped taking their kids to school because they now needed more labor. So there's a link between deforestation and increase in child labor. So one solution to child labor would be for them to diversify. Obviously, there's a link between poverty and child labor. We know this, but from a cocoa perspective, if you study the issue from just cocoa and nothing else, study the labor relations in cocoa, there's a link between deforestation and increase in child labor, slave labor, and so on, especially in Côte d'Ivoire.
Thank you so much for that, both of you. It's so helpful to hear this. I had a related question here. One of the things that we encounter repeatedly in our trainings on cocoa quality are questions around insecurity, where essentially what is preventing the cocoa producers we work with from improving the quality of their cocoa is not their knowledge, it is not their desire to improve the quality, but it is rather an issue of insecurity. And I mean, quite literally, there are times when it is not safe for them to go out in their areas and harvest. There might be times when other people in the area come and steal part of their harvest. So there are all kinds of insecurity issues. But in some of the countries where we work, this precarious labor, it has a type of social cachet associated with it. I'm thinking, for example, of the country of Mexico, the country of Colombia. I think we could make an argument that parts of the Philippines fit within this. These are three countries that have a long-standing chocolate consumption tradition, but where certain of the areas where cacao is being produced have become highly insecure due to, say, guerrilla activity, drug trafficking, or otherwise. And I'm curious, given your perspective on West Africa, would you think with me about what it means for these labor conditions to persist, where in fact the value of the labor is not compensated? It is certainly in fact precarious labor, but it has a kind of social capital associated with it. I've always been curious to hear what you might think of that.
This sound broke up a little tiny bit on mine, so I'm not sure I understood all the question. Can I have a moment to think of a good answer? I might very cheekily pass over to Michael.
I think that's a very, very interesting observation. I think one understudied part of cocoa farming is the link between the social relations of labor in cocoa farming. That is cocoa itself and cocoa farming communities. How do they arrange labor? This is a very interesting thing, which I think there's nobody studying it. However, when you study the way cocoa farmers, specifically cocoa farmers that have to export, the way their relationship to labor, it's something which I think I can't say much about it because I haven't studied it. But if you study cocoa cultivation historically, let's say late 19th century, the issues of child labor and slave labor is not new. It has been, especially in West Africa, it has been going on for long. But the link between, in my view, I don't know if I'm just trying to see if I understand your question. I'm just trying to talk around the question. I think that there's a direct link between forest and labor. So the question I would like to ask you, just to see if you can clarify your question better, it's what is the forest condition in these areas that you're talking about?
Yeah.
So maybe,
yeah. Thank you, Michael. So in fact, in some of these areas, cocoa farmers are being directly encouraged to be part of a reforestation. Of course, to preserve agroforestry that might already exist, or to go out and plant new trees. And these are in areas where land might have been sold, for example, in Tabasco, Mexico, land might have been sold for oil production, and there's a goal to kind of preserve it or reforest it in some ways, or in areas like Colombia, where land is being rehabilitated from coca production for cocaine into cacao, which of course in many ways is actually a less valuable crop for farmers to be producing, but is one that provides them with a greater degree of social security.
Okay. Yeah. I think of course, if you want to understand the labor issue, you'd have to discuss it in context of this broader. So that's one of the points I'm making. There's a link between just the way you understand forest deforestation and the way you understand labor. You can't divorce these two things. Côte d'Ivoire is the classic example. 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s. There's almost no study of there's child work, but not child labor the way we have it now. There's almost no child slavery or child trafficking. But the moment you come to 1998 with the restrictive land policy, deforestation, then you have a change in the labor relations. So what we are discussing now in terms of child labor and slave labor, it's a function of this change in labor relations. So I mean, I imagine that Mexico and Nicaragua, they would have their own domestic equivalents of this. So maybe that's what you're talking about. I haven't read much about cocoa farming in the Americans.
As I process your question, Carla, my brain is kind of going in strange directions. And I think one thing which I kind of want to say is I think you've hit on something really important here around insecurity. And I think this is the kind of qualitative, important thing that isn't being captured at the moment in any of the policy debates. Because all the qualitative sides, the fears and insecurities, is like, farmers not wanting to invest, not wanting to do things, bushfires, and problems around labour and all those kind of things are part of a whole range of things that are chronically missed by the policymakers, because they're not the kind of thing that you can easily capture in a survey, and then it doesn't lend itself well to any kind of econometric analysis. And actually farmers do live with chronic insecurities and problems, and actually these are important things and they should be a big part of policy debates, and they're not. Sorry, just a thought that came into my mind then.
Yeah, thanks to both of you for entertaining the question, which I know was not what we had programmed, but having this opportunity to talk with you about it, I thought was essential, because in the countries where we're working, these are repeat issues and they go central. So often the focus is on worst forms of child labor, is on human trafficking, but I think that the labor conditions of cacao production are far more complex than only those two value issues. And certainly in the Latin American case, we get into these questions around insecurity and this real, in many ways, almost a romanticization by policymakers of the value of cacao growing. This is something that I think the specialty cacao industry is guilty of as well, is this idea that cacao farmers are doing some kind of essential cultural service in addition to quite literally using their bodies to produce something that will then be consumed. So thanks for that.
Yeah. It will be interesting to know if the labor conditions you're referring to, if they exist in other crops as opposed to just cocoa.
Right, thanks, Michael. They do, for example, in coffee, in some of the countries that I have in mind, in bananas, we run into similar issues. So it's certainly a cross-crop issue for further study. To be continued on that.
Along this line, we have been finding the living wage work from Ankur and Ankur to be helpful in terms of identifying, without the topic of crop and country specifically, but coming from what is the basic basket of goods that farmers need to live on as farming households on one side, and what is the difference when as an employee, and what is the difference when as an entrepreneur. And I think this is the unique thing about cacao, is they're often entrepreneurial families with 1 to 3 hectares. And then the labor conditions around that are quite different to these larger scale plantations, which typically have employee-based relations. Certainly, we recently had a conversation with Anthony Fontaine and Friedel Hutz-Adams exactly on this topic of just even having in mind the difference economically between wage and income, profit and loss, and then all of the points you've mentioned before, Michael, regarding all of the additional costs and inputs that it actually takes to translate knowledge to practice. And to grow. This is certainly, I think, helpful in this perspective.
Staying within this space, as we mentioned earlier about representation, I would just like both of your thoughts for a moment on the farmers' needs. And of course, as we also discussed, there could be various elements within that, depending on what country we're speaking about. But where do you feel like people have been overlooked, or what groups specifically have been left out of the conversations?
I think farmers have been left out of the conversation. Well, I mean, it depends on where we're talking about. Again, if it's Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, farmers have been left out of the conversation. And I remember I once attended a sort of cocoa meeting in a village in Cote d'Ivoire. So women generally are often left out of this conversation, yeah, obviously. But in this meeting, there were women, different cocoa, almost everybody in the little village came together and just in the gathering, you can see power relations taking form there. So some people are there, but they can't actually talk. Others are there, but they can talk. So I'm not sure if just having a conversation is enough, because you can have a staged conversation. Multinationals do it all the time. They just consult people, and at the end of the day, they do what they want to do. So the real question ought to be how to actually integrate, instead of just the conversation part, or how to integrate actual farmers' need into some of these programs. And the way of doing it is what Carla is currently doing, which is to give them put them in the driver's seat, for them to be the one to maybe coordinate or, direct the conversation as well as the intervention itself, not the conversation. There can be a distinction. There's a distinction between the conversation and the intervention. And the way of doing about that is obviously to put them in the driver's seat. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think the thing that has amazed me the most in the course of the last 20 years is the repeated failure to engage with farmers in any kind of meaningful way. They are left out of conversations all the time. I have sat in meetings with policymakers from industry, from NGOs, from all sorts, and everybody is talking about the farmers. And for example, in the area of child labour, they're all discussing the lives of these children and what the farmers are going to need to do. Now, if somebody was having a conversation about the lives of my children, I'd expect to be at the table. And I think it's very, very odd that people somehow feel they have a right to be discussing the rights and best interests and things that others should or shouldn't be doing without consulting them in any way. This has been a repeated pattern over the years, and I find it very, very problematic indeed. There's a complete failure to engage, and it means bad policy making comes out of it, because, you know, you can plan all sorts of interventions and say, right, farmers should do X, Y, and Z, unless you've actually spoken to the farmers and they're prepared to be on board and they're interested and they're engaged or whatever. It's not going to work, you know. And it's just human nature. You can't just tell people what to do and then be surprised that they don't do it. You know, engage them in conversation. You know, it's not that hard. I had a conversation with a cocoa farmer yesterday. You know, it's not impossible to communicate with them. I'm sitting here in England, but, you know, it is possible to communicate. Now, of course, I can understand that it's not possible to get the entire population of farmers to every possible meeting, but it's certainly possible to have much, much better engagement than we've got now. I remember a few years ago talking to a representative from a very big organisation that works with cocoa farmers, and I said to him, you know, you guys need to talk to farmers more. He said, that's ridiculous. We talk to farmers all the time. He said, we have NGOs, that's what we pay NGOs for. We tell the NGOs what we want the farmers to do, and they go off and do it. Works for everyone. Now, that's not my definition of engagement. It's not my definition of communication or conversation, but that seems to be the way the world is working, and it's problematic, but that seems to be how it works.
Perhaps this is one of the great things that digital communication offers us in terms of liberating voices where possible and getting into conversations. Certainly something that Carla and I would really love to do with the FCCI Cacao Academy is bring them forward, not just tailor services towards their needs, but actually sharing those answers back.
We have just about 10 minutes left of the conversation, so I would like to see if there's any final questions, maybe before we move into that last area of space, or even just asking Amanda or Michael if there are certain themes that are very dear to their heart that we didn't get to yet.
So from my perspective, oh, go ahead, Liz.
No, please.
Okay, so from my perspective, I'm always learning from reading your writing, from hearing you speak, and I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity to talk with you. Liz, I'll turn it to you.
Likewise, I wanted to ask either of you regarding the topic of intergenerational knowledge. From what we understand historically, cacao farming and farming generally is parsed between families. My father is a Papua New Guinean farmer and he learned from his father. I learned from my father. This is definitely very much how we learn. Yet, as we know, Michael, you mentioned before the average age of farmers in West Africa is older. And Amanda, you've also mentioned before about the role of communicating with children to enunciate their concerns and opportunities directly. Where do you see the opportunity to identify young adults in a strong way to be part of this next generation of cacao farming that is either diversified or is self-driven, is resilient and independent in a way? What do you see for this generation? Amanda?
I mean, ideally, ultimately, the thing is just making cocoa farming attractive enough that that question takes care of itself. You know, and I don't know if that's really possible at the moment, but I think, you know, if cocoa farming is made attractive enough, then it will naturally attract that next generation of individual. Yeah. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think one of the reasons why younger people are not attracted to cocoa farming is because, you know, it's not attracted to them. I'm happy about this. I'm not going to lie, because I want most of these countries to stop producing cocoa. But in Ghana, there's a spraying program by the Cocoa Board, whereby they would spray, I think 98, 99% of cocoa farms. This is one way that the government is actually getting young people interested in cocoa. They are the ones doing the spraying, going around checking all the farms. And I think, I'm not sure if it's Nestle, they're trying to open a sort of cocoa school in both Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana to get young people to be interested. Of course, I'm opposed to this, but that's one way of going about it. I think if cocoa farming is interested, if it's profitable, then young people will get into it. But if it's not profitable, then it's better for young people to do something else. Instead of cultivating cocoa for the sake of cultivating cocoa. Yeah.
I think Michael's got stronger views than I have on these matters.
That's what makes it interesting. Within this context, I wonder what role land ownership and inheritance law has to do with these opportunities. So I understand and agree completely with the points. If it is an attractive business, go into it. Absolutely. I wonder regarding, yes, what opportunities or what influences do you see land law, land title, and inheritance transparency to be playing in this area, where one who is a young adult could see an opportunity to craft out their own future, should they have a legal and regulatory framework that supports their wealth transfer?
I think land title is crucial to this, especially in Cote d'Ivoire again, because in the 1960s, the government created an open land policy. The government basically said land belongs to whoever cultivates. This is one way to get people to cultivate cocoa. But I think in 1998, they changed from an open land to a restrictive land policy. The reason for this is because most of the forests at that particular time, they were all gone. And there were so many land conflicts. Actually, that's basically a transition point in Cote d'Ivoire from forest to deforestation. In Ghana, I think the situation in Ghana it's a little different. But I think land ownership is crucial to this. To just go to a cocoa producing community and buy or even occupy any land. I think it's crucial. Land ownership and as well as land title is crucial to cocoa cultivation in West Africa.
I can see we've only got 3 minutes left, and there's a burning point I want to get off my chest, if that's okay. And unfortunately, it doesn't relate to land ownership. One of the things that has always frustrated me immensely in agricultural extension programs is that they do not take into account individual farmers' beliefs. And that is something that I think your program is going to solve, and I think this is really important and really good. What do I mean by that specifically? There were particular reasons in the Dominican Republic why farmers were never going to prune their trees. So you could tell them 5,000 times, you could tell them till you're blue in the face that they should be pruning their trees. They were never going to do it because of particular cultural reasons or whatever. Those are the kind of things that need to be engaged with directly, not providing blanket agricultural extension advice, specifically targeting people's views. Same in Ghana, they had particular views about black pod, about particular things that meant that the agricultural extension advice they were receiving was never going to be effective. We need to listen to them about their specific beliefs. It's not enough to just say they're wrong. They may well be wrong, but that's not the point. Unless you listen to them, the advice one gives is going to be absolutely pointless. So again, this isn't a trap that you guys are falling into at all because you're doing things completely differently, but this has been a source of great frustration to me over the years. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to vent about this.
It's our pleasure. We like to finish with a fun set of questions that might help you summarize some of those feelings. And that would be what you would express on a billboard, and as well as what we can offer you, whether that be this team here or the audience is listening, that we can better help you do your work.
I think my message to put on a billboard would be learn to listen. Don't, and again, this isn't a message for you individually, but don't be kind of white allies who speak for the farmers. Actually talk to the farmers, give the farmers a chance to speak for themselves and listen and engage with what they've got to say. That is my message. Learn to listen.
For me, it depends on who's reading the billboard. If I can put a message on the billboard for farmers, it would be to diversify, stop producing cocoa, produce something else. There's so many things that they can produce, especially in West Africa. I have no message I mean, if the message is to multinationals, it will have to be, you know, something else. But diversification is my main message, especially to cocoa farmers in West Africa.
Thank you. And anything we can do that helps you in your work and research and projects?
Yeah, I was also going to ask if there's any plan to take this training program to, say, maybe to an African country, for example, so maybe Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana. So if there's any plan to do that, I don't know.
Yes, the aspiration is absolutely there. We are starting small and cautiously in countries where we have already engaged and can responsibly innovate, because, and I think Liz has put this really well, the ethical idea that you can try out something new on farmers is not one that we, you know, that is unethical in our mind. And so we're working with groups that we already know, where we know that what we provide to them will be responsible. But as we move in from phase 1, which we're in now, into phase 2, phase 3, absolutely, we aspire to work in these countries as well.
There's nothing from my perspective that you could do. For me, I mean, I think that just all the work of FCCI is a breath of fresh air, because it provides an alternative to the mainstream thinking. It's giving a voice to people who don't normally get it. It's a different way of thinking. It is very research driven. It engages with all sorts of sources. And I think for all those reasons, I think that you couldn't do more than what you're doing already. So thank you. Actually, perhaps that should be my message. Thank you for all your hard work.
Well, thank you all for being a part of this discussion today. It's been a treat to have you with us and partake in today's conversation. For those on the other end listening, we also appreciate your questions and comments, and leave them below. And we will, of course, be back for episode 8 next week. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. This was brilliant. Everyone take good care, stay healthy.